Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Chris Hislop. I'm the Executive Director at the Montana World Affairs Council. We're excited to have you all here. I'm just looking to see who's out there. I see Troy, Potomac, Crow Agency, Creston, Lockwood, Drummond, and more to come. So it's really great to have you all on today for our very first event of GeoQuest. Let me tell you a little bit about the organization. The Montana World Affairs Council is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering global understanding and awareness in Montana's communities and in our classrooms, like yours. Our mission is to bring the world to Montana and Montana to the world, and we do this through a range of global affairs programs. Our new program, GeoQuest, which is this one today, is focused on you, the middle school students across Montana. It uses geography as an entry point to explore a huge range of world topics. You'll be immersed in geography, culture, world affairs to help you understand the international impact these places have on you and your communities. Information is on a virtual interactive platform that's done through our friends here at Inspired Classroom, and it makes it easy for you to interact and work together. Your teachers, by the way, have a great deal of support through a package with all the necessary background for every session. The final product is your own co-created interactive map featuring geographical information about each country you visit and about your own communities. So we're bringing all of this stuff about the world and your communities together, and you're going to help us do that. We hope this helps you examine local, global, and international ideas to understand and appreciate different perspectives, interact with others, and take responsible action. Before I introduce today's special guest, I'd like to thank the Council in the Classroom and GeoQuest sponsors, the Dennis and Phyllis Washington Foundation, Qatar Foundation International, Allegiance, BNSF Railway Foundation, First Interstate Bank, Trail West Bank, and the Consulate of Ireland in San Francisco. Now let me introduce Ambassador Anne Patterson. She was the Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern North African Affairs at the Department of State before being appointed to the Dow Jones Special Committee in April 2018. She served as Ambassador to Egypt from 2011 to 2013, which brings us to our show today. And then she was also Ambassador in Pakistan, Colombia, and El Salvador. She recently retired with the rank of Career Ambassador after more than 4 decades of foreign service. Ambassador Patterson also served as Assistant Secretary of State for International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs and Deputy Permanent Representative to the United Nations, among other assignments. She's currently a Senior Fellow at the Jackson Institute of Global Affairs at Yale and a member of the Commission on National Defense Strategy. Ambassador Patterson, you are very welcome. Thank you for joining our show. I wonder if we could hand over to you to talk a little bit about Egypt and your experience there.
Yes, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you to all the World Affairs Council and the students and teachers who put this event together. I'm also looking forward to participating in the GeoQuest event next March with some of my fellow ambassadors. Let me tell you something about myself, because it wasn't obvious that I would end up in a foreign affairs field. I grew up in Arkansas. It's another main agricultural state, much like Montana, except with chickens and rice. I went to school in Texas and college in Boston. In 1973, my mother saw an advertisement in a magazine, and it said, "The Foreign Service needs women." And I just graduated from school, and she said, "You're not doing anything, go take this test." So I went and took to Little Rock, Arkansas, and took the test. And 43 years later, I retired. I think these events are so useful because I have seen massive changes in my period in foreign affairs, and you too are going to see massive changes in your lifetime. Foreign affairs and international relations are going to be more and more important to the United States. So I really applaud the people who have put this program together so you'll understand them better and benefit from them. I'm also impressed with the variety of countries that you've been studying, which I think is a really good selection. But let me talk about Egypt, because we're here to talk about the countries you're studying. Most people, when I think think about Egypt, they think about the pyramids, they think about the Nile, they think about ancient Egypt and the cradle of civilization. Some say that Egypt dates back to 5,000 years before Christ, but certainly Egypt dominated the ancient world for many, many centuries. Many Americans get their information about Egypt from the movies, The Mummy's Curse. My two sons love this movie about the curse from King Tut's tomb and watched it over and over. And I will never forget visiting some of these sites. They were awe-inspiring. And I hope as you grow older, you'll have an opportunity to travel and see things like the Nile and the ancient sites. But history is interesting and important, but I want to talk to you about modern day Egypt because that's what's going to affect your lives. As American citizens, you'll go to work and go to school in the real world. And I also want to talk to you about Montana's place in the world, which interestingly had some links with Egypt. First, the fundamental lifeline of Egypt hasn't changed in 5,000 years, and that's the Nile River. I always thought it was the longest river in the world, but when I was getting ready to talk to you, I saw that there was some competition with the Amazon River in South America, but it is a lifeline for something like 20 countries in Africa. For thousands of years, when it flooded, it left behind silt so farmers could grow productive crops on it. And it was this agricultural wealth that enabled Egypt to be a powerhouse for literally thousands of years. But now in the 20th century, Egypt has increasingly limited land and water. A major dam was constructed in the 60s for electricity and to regulate the flow of the Nile, and that had some unintended consequences. Other countries in Africa also depend on this, and this has caused conflict over water resources, which I want to talk a minute about. Egypt has also, like many other countries, become increasingly a desert country, so farmers could only grow crops along that very narrow Nile basin. And when I lived there, I was simply amazed about how little it rained. I lived in Saudi Arabia too. It rained twice in 2 years when I lived there, sprinkle, and I mean sprinkle, not even rain. 97% of Egypt's fresh water comes from the River Nile. I think most Americans take water for granted. Surely I know there are parts of our country with water shortages, but fresh water in Egypt is declining. Farmers can't grow their crops. A neighboring country in Africa is building a dam on the Nile, which will cut water flow to the Nile. And Egypt is threatening to take military action. So countries elsewhere in the world go to war over water resources. We are extraordinarily lucky in the United States that we don't have these constraints. And I wanted to talk a minute about Montana and how Montana is different from Egypt. How many of you have parents or relatives or work in the agricultural field, farms or ranches? Could you all raise your hand? It's a lot. Well, that makes sense. Well, why is the US the most powerful country in the world? Well, we have a really strong military. We have a very innovative industry. We make computers and cell phones and life-saving drugs. But the US is also one of the most powerful countries in the world because we grow so much food. Our agricultural industry is the most powerful, the most productive in the world. And we produce so much food that we can export it to other countries in much of the world. And if a country can't feed its own people, it always has to depend on other countries. Let me give you a couple of figures that show how different Egypt is from Montana. In Egypt, the average farm is 2.5 acres. I mean, they're building lots where I live that are 2.5 acres. In Montana, it's over 2,100 acres, which I realize is an average. In the US, only 1.7% of our population works on the land. In other words, a few 100,000 people in the US feed ourselves and much of the rest of the world. In Egypt, over a third of 100 million people work in farms, but they can't feed themselves. And one of Montana's main products is wheat, and Egypt is the largest importer of wheat in the world because it can't provide enough. Egypt's a poor country as well. It has 100 million people, and about half of them live on $2 a day. In Montana, the income level is, of course, much, much higher, even though there are poor people there. But in every country I've lived in overseas, when Americans come to visit, most of them are shocked how most people in the world live with little to eat and poor health care and poor sanitation. One of the main problems in Egypt is that there are not enough jobs for people entering the labor force. Half of Egypt's population is under 25 years of age, unlike our population, which has a lot of elderly people. It's a very young population. When young people can't find jobs, they can't get married, they can't start families, and they become extremely frustrated. In Egypt, university education isn't very good either. So what you've seen is a lot of families who pay for their children to be educated, but then they go out and they can't find a job. I know that you all have been talking about the Sustainable Development Goals for foreign countries. I often use the Human Development Index to show relative levels. Egypt ranks 116 out of 189 countries. The United States ranks 15th, and Montana is smack in the middle of America's Human Development Index. But it's a good signal about how populations are treated in countries. Egypt's an Islamic country. In fact, it's probably the most important Islamic country in the world. It is home to the most famous Islamic university in the world. It's also home to one of the oldest Christian communities in the world, the Copts. They're about 10% of the population. These Copts believe that the Holy Family traveled in Egypt when Jesus was an infant, and there are many sites in Egypt that commemorate the travel of the Holy Family. Egypt also had a very thriving Jewish community until they were kicked out of Egypt in the 50s. So it's a polyglot society in many respects, and much more ethnically interesting and diverse than many other Arab countries. I wanted to mention too that one of the real struggles in the Islamic world is the role of women. In Egypt, only 65% of the women can read and write. They mostly cover their hair because of their religious beliefs. And women in Egypt are fighting hard to go to school, to get equal inheritance, to get equal opportunity to take jobs. Still, they lag behind their ability to men, but I think this is changing, certainly in Egypt and in other places in the Islamic world. And then I thought I might say a few words about the political situation in Egypt, which has gotten a lot of attention in recent years. This matters because elections, as we're about to find out in this country, are the way.
Ambassador Patterson, can I interrupt you for a second? I want to pause because this is a lot of information for our students, and I'm wondering if we can break it down and see if they have any questions right now. And I'd actually like to throw a question back at them, like starting back with the agricultural. So I saw that there were a lot of hands raised, and looking at the list of schools that we have, I can see that there are a lot of schools that are in agricultural areas in Montana that are participating today. And so I'm wondering if we can pause for a second, and I would like the students to turn and talk to one another, and then we'll report back, and I'd like to hear a little bit about what that looks like in your community. So what are people growing? How big are your ranches? Do you have a river? Is there irrigation nearby? Or are you like dry land wheat? Are you dependent on the rain? So go ahead, let's take a minute and 12 seconds to talk about that, and then we're going to come report back out, and then we'll be able to ask some questions and then move on to the political climate. So, ready, set, talk. Okay, so I have a list of all of our participating schools. I'm going to go through and call on you. When I do, I'd like to have one representative go ahead and share what their class discussed, and they'll unmute their microphone, and then we'll move on to the next one. So we're going to start in Troy with Robert's class. Kathleen, do you have to unmute them?
No, it says ask.
Yep, that's what you have to do.
You did.
Yep, perfect. We can hear you.
Oh, they can't see you. Okay. The kids are telling me that. Okay, so Troy is mostly what you can share. What do we have mostly in Troy? Elijah? Mining. And there's a lot of farming. Okay, we have, what kind of farms do we have here? We have gardens. We're limited
Yep.
in large farming if you live in the rocky flat class, mountains. So more small farms, small farming,
So,
raising of
Troy,
their
I
own.
have a question. I have a question for you. And several Troys. Do you get a lot of rain?
Yeah. Not as much as we used to. It's changing, but we used to get, yes, we do get some rain.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So I'm going to ask the other classes in Troy to give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down if that seems similar, if you agree or disagree. Oh, I'm seeing lots of agreement. Perfect. Okay, so we'll talk to the other classes in Troy on our next round. Let's move to Potomac. Potomac. Okay,
All right.
there you are.
Yeah. All right. So Casey's our speaker.
So we grow lots of alfalfa and have lots of ranches that raise cattle and horses and lots of livestock.
Okay, great. So alfalfa, cattle, horses, livestock over in Potomac. Where does your water come from?
Usually just creeks or rivers or something like irrigation.
What's the main river that goes by?
Lots of times the Blackfoot River.
Yep. Yep. Excellent. Thank you, Potomac. Okay, let's go to Lockwood School. Mr. Vanderbeck, I believe. Okay, Mr. Vanderbeck, I think is going to pass. How about if we go to Crow Agency Hardin, Mr. Michael's class? Ms. Michael's class, my apologies.
Okay, Avatia is going to be our speaker. So what type of agriculture do we have, Avatia? Ranches and cattle. And what's our water source? The Little Bighorn River.
Yes, thank you, Hardin. I appreciate that. Let's see, is Drummond with us today?
Good job. Remind me for point.
Yes, Drummond's here, and we are going to have Piper and Cameron and Abby are going to speak for us.
Excellent. Come on up, Piper, Cameron, and Abby.
You're going to have to squish down, Abby.
So
Speak up nice and loud.
for crops, we grow alfalfa, oats, and barley. Our main river is Lake River. We have many cattle companies and
Ranching and cattle companies.
Ranching and cattle companies, alfalfa, barley, and oats. Interesting. And then let's see, I think we have a family, a homeschool family from Missoula, the Wonder Followers. Are you there? What's happening around Missoula?
We have a lot of small vegetable farms around Missoula, including at our house. We have a well, but the general Missoula population has an aquifer.
Yes, wonderful. Thank you guys so much. So that's interesting that although Montana is predominantly, the wheat is the #1 export, the schools that we have on had a lot of other crops and different water sources than a lot of the eastern part of the state. So I think what's represented is most of our schools on today are more western and south central. Well, yeah, Crow Agency, you're a little bit, you're further east, absolutely, but you're also very, very southern. And it's really that northwest part of Montana where we get a lot of the dry land wheat production in Montana. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Ambassador Patterson to continue.
Well, thank you, but and let me say that one of the issues is the small number of people in Montana, which has, I guess, slightly over 1 million people to produce all these agricultural crops. Whereas Egypt, there are 30 million people trying to make their living from agriculture, largely unsuccessfully because of the small farm size and the lack of water. Lack of water is a huge problem in Africa and the Middle East, and we could talk a long time about that, but the United States is blessed because of our water resources. But let me just make a few comments about the political situation, and then maybe we can talk, you can ask questions and we can go back and forth. I think some of you had seen the upheaval in Egypt in 2011. When all these young people came into Tahrir Square and basically protested the fact they didn't have jobs, they didn't have a future. President Mubarak, who'd been in for 40 years, was overthrown. An election came forward. The elected representative was overthrown by the military. So there were a lot of riots and upheavals and a very difficult environment when I was there for 2 years. But now Egypt is unfortunately pretty much a military dictatorship. And it's interesting to contrast this. In the US, you all can pretty much say what you want. In Egypt, you're thrown in jail if you criticize the government. The press says what it wants in this country. And in Egypt, if you criticize the government, you're pretty much, you can be thrown in jail too. There's supposedly around 60,000 people in Egyptian jails for minor crimes. So this is a very difficult political situation for the US and any country really to work through. The problem with this kind of situation is that the issues of unemployment, of lack of jobs, of lack of a future, those haven't gone away. So sooner or later, I think we'll see civil unrest in Egypt again, because people know that there are places in the world that have futures and prosperity, and Egyptians are trying to immigrate. So I think at some point we'll see civil unrest again. But I can't emphasize enough how agriculture and water is a driver of these problems. And when people can't make a living, they're very unhappy, and they go to the streets and they throw out their government. So I think I'll stop here and let you ask questions about Egypt or related issues that you've studied. Thank you.
Thank you. So let's go back through and we're going to think about some questions. That's a lot of really interesting information, and some of the points that I heard Ambassador Patterson talk about were the agriculture, the water, and also the fact that there are limited jobs and how that's really hard, especially on young people who want to start their life and start working and build a family. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through, again, the groups I'll call in each classroom, and go ahead and have an opportunity to ask Ambassador Patterson a question about Egypt. I'm seeing all sorts of hands. We'll start with one question from each group, and I suspect that will probably lead to some more questions as well, and also some more discussion. So we are going to go ahead this time and start in Troy, but we're going to start with Mrs. Arpin's class.
We're looking for questions about, not Africa, Egypt. How many homes or families would you think live without water?
Were you able to hear that?
No, I couldn't hear it. Could you repeat it? Thank you.
So she's looking for
Closer with my
yes, please, come on up. Come on up. This is Tuesday Strong.
My question was, how many homes and families would you think live without water?
I don't know the answer to that, but what I saw with my own eyes is that a lot of people carry water. In other words, they go into taps or spigots and carry it. But so I think particularly in rural areas, a lot of them are without water or have to get it. They have no running water. Fundamentally, they have no running water. And I used to, in Western Egypt, where it's mostly desert now, that problem is really acute. So what happens when people don't have water, they move. And that's another phenomenon that's taking place in Egypt and in other parts of Africa, is they move to the cities and put a lot of pressure on the water resources and other resources in the cities. So it sort of has lots of effects, the lack of water. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's go to Winslow's class in Troy.
Introduce yourself.
My name is Connor Powell, and I was wondering what is their curfew like over there in Egypt? Do they have a different kind of consequence if somebody gets caught after curfew, or do they have an earlier curfew?
Egyptians, when I was there, mostly there was a curfew. And it was 11 o'clock because frankly, there were riots all the time. And what happened when people didn't?
I was wondering how America's poverty issue is different from Egypt.
Oh, that is such a good question.
What does she think?
What do you think? What do you think? Do you have any thoughts on that before she comes back on? What are some things that you've observed or heard this morning?
I think that we're slightly addressing a poverty issue more than Egypt, mostly because we're more of a powerhouse in government and agriculture, and we have a lot more money than Egypt, so we can give more financial aid to the homeless. While they're a poorer country, so they can't give financial aid as much to their people, and they have a lot of riots going on and stuff for equality and to overthrow the government, so they don't have a lot of options to help those, because almost everybody there is in poverty, so they have a way to address the situation.
That's a really good observation. How do the rest of the classes feel about that? Do you agree with what she said? And you can show me I agree with that, or I don't agree with that, or I'm really not sure. I see a lot of people agreeing, a couple who are not agreeing, and some people, yep, and some people that are not sure. I think that's a wonderful thing to wonder about and to question, and I wonder the same thing. What does it look like in other countries? And how is that impacted? And Ambassador Patterson needs some help. Okay, we're we're gonna keep going through some questions. We're gonna get everything queued up. Apparently, Washington D.C. is having some technical difficulties this morning, which happened. I know Missoula also had some technical difficulties in which our internet in the entire town was out. So if you,
I'm writing down the questions.
so we're writing down your questions. So we're going to keep those questions going, and when she comes back on, we'll be able to ask them. So let's move over to Potomac. Potomac, what questions? Oh, she's coming back. Oh, good.
Let's see. There she is.
Oh, good. She's back.
I'm sorry, I don't know what happened.
We're so glad that you're back. Oh my goodness, and we have some pretty incredible questions from students.
Okay, please go ahead with the questions.
Absolutely. So just to back up to the curfew, you dropped off right when you were about to tell us about whether or not there were any, if there was a more severe punishment if you were caught out after curfew, or that was different in any way.
No, I think mostly they put in jail most of their political opposition and basically threw away the key. But for routine curfew violations, most of those people would be released within a few days.
We were talking a little bit about how some of us have curfews within our families where you have to be home for dinner or you have to be in the house by this time, and it's a little bit different.
It is different.
It's a little bit different, yep. And then we had a question from Troy also about poverty and what poverty looks like in Egypt versus in the United States, and what's the difference. And she had some really good thoughts on that. She had mentioned that she thought that maybe since we were a little bit more of a powerhouse and had some more money, that we were able to have some more programs to help the homeless populations, but wanted to hear your take on what does poverty look like in Egypt versus the United States.
There's no comparison between poverty in the U.S. and poverty in a place like Egypt. In a place like Egypt, if you're poor and you live on $2 a day, you don't have enough food, you don't have access to medical care, you probably have things like skin diseases and parasites, and you have an extraordinarily low level of sanitation, both from human and animal waste. It's a bit hard to describe, but it's much, much worse than poverty in the U.S. You wouldn't have TV, you wouldn't have internet, you wouldn't have all the services that we take for granted. And to use an example outside of Egypt, when I was ambassador to Pakistan, I'd see these little children, and I think the child was maybe 3, and the child was really 6. So they have all this poverty stunts the growth of children, and it also affects their future mental capacity. It's very, very different.
Thank you. And so the next question comes from Potomac, and they're wondering if they have the same kind of K-12 school system that we do in the United States.
Actually, that was Lockwood.
Oh, I'm sorry. This was Lockwood. I apologize. That was Lockwood.
The same kind of what? I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
School system, like a K-12 school system that we do.
Yes, there's public education. If people can afford it, they often spend money on private schools because the public education system isn't very good. And one thing the U.S. government and is done a lot over the years is try to help countries like Egypt invest in public education and teacher training, because one of frankly, the facts of life in these countries, Egypt and others, is that teachers are grossly underpaid and probably don't make more than a few $100s a month. So one of the things that that all our assistance programs is trying to do is train teachers to build schools, to improve sanitation. But yes, there's public education in these countries.
Great, thank you. So now let's go to Potomac. Potomac, it's your turn to ask a question.
All right, go for it. Why did you choose to stick being an ambassador? And what was the most interesting and challenging thing about it?
Well, as I mentioned, I sort of joined the State Department on a whim because my mother saw an ad. And actually, my most interesting country was Pakistan. And because it was a very interesting time there, and it was a fascinating country. But Egypt was also extraordinarily interesting because, of course, it's as I mentioned, the heartland of the Arab world. And I was there at a very interesting time politically because we had almost four governments in the country. So all these posts have been interesting and frankly, hugely different. And that's one thing that was so interesting about my over 40 years is that it was all so interesting and so different. And that's why I'd urge you, as you grow up, to look at careers in foreign affairs, because the variety is simply fascinating.
Thank you. Let's go to Hardin. I saw a hooray from Hardin.
Go ahead and say it really loud. Say it loud.
Does the lack of weather change the weather? Does the lack of water change the weather there?
Good question.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
She said, does the lack of water change the weather? Does it have an impact on the weather?
I think that the reverse is true, that increasing the lack of rain and desertification has affected the water situation quite dramatically. There's no rain. The Nile, I won't say it's drying up, that would be an overstatement, but there's less water coming out of the rain. And one thing I assume you all will get into in these discussions of the countries you're studying is climate change. I can't evaluate that in Egypt because I'm not an expert in climate change, but most Egyptians say that the situation, the lack of rain, the lack of water, the lack of, has gotten worse in the past 50 years.
Thank you, thank you. Let's move to Drummond. Drummond, do you have a question for the ambassador?
There we are. Thank you, Dalton. You could introduce yourself too.
My name's Dalton Southers, and my question. My name's Dalton Southers, and then my question is, on average, how much does the average person get of education there?
That's the average person by their statistics gets a 9th grade education. But so that's the fact. But what you see is huge differences among the cities and the rural areas. And where you see high rates of people who can't read and write are in the rural areas. And when I said that only 65% of the women can read and write, most of that 35% who can't read and write are in villages, and particularly in Eastern Egypt. But there's another factor of education, which is a lot of people have gone to universities and can't get jobs now. So those people I interviewed after Tahrir Square, I met this young man, and I asked him, I said, why were you in the center of Tahrir Square protesting the government? And he said I had graduated from college or university, and he said I hadn't been able to find a job for 8 years. And so the level of frustration and anger would be very high for somebody like that.
Thank you. Let's move to the Wonder Followers.
Ambassador Patterson, we're wondering what your favorite part of Egypt was.
My favorite part of Egyptians, and are very fun-loving people. They like music, they like entertainment, they like dance. They enjoy themselves, and when you would see these lights on the Nile, it was really fun to see. And then going to visit some of these ancient sites are really an extraordinary experience. So that was also a very nice experience. I got a couple of questions on chat, but let's go through the questions from the classes too.
Excellent. Now I believe we have Creston on as well. So Creston, do you have a question? Miss Williams' class. Oh, yep, I see him.
I was wondering what's the most common job?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear.
I was wondering what's the most common job?
The most common job.
The most common
Job.
Interesting question. The most common job is frankly in tourism. And you see a lot of university graduates as tourist guides, and something like 9% of Egypt's labor force works in tourism, in jobs that frankly aren't very well paid. So when tourism drops, as it has now because of the pandemic, these people are pretty much out on the street. And when I was there, tourism had dropped dramatically, of course, because of civil unrest, and Americans in particular, and Japanese, and 1 million Russians go to Egypt for tourism as well. That had all dried up. So of course the jobs had dried up as well, but the most jobs in the country are in tourism. Apart from agriculture.
Yes, I'd like to draw a parallel between that and Montana, in which we have a pretty robust tourism economy in Montana as well. I'm wondering, from Janessa Williams' class, do you know where people are coming to visit in Montana? Can you think of some places?
We were talking about Glacier National Park, the huge one that people come to visit.
Absolutely. Glacier National Park, Yellowstone National Park. A lot of people come to see those places, right? And some of our bigger cities as well are starting to get quite a bit of tourism as well, and it's a pretty big industry in the state of Montana as well. I have a question for the ambassador, and I believe our homeschool class touched on this a little bit, but one of the things that I am wondering about are what are some of the positive things that you see coming out of Egypt? We've talked about a lot of struggles that Egyptians face. What are some of the positive things that Egyptians are doing, or things that are happening over in Egypt?
Well, I think the Egyptian people are enormously resilient. They've been able to adapt over thousands of years of social and economic change, and I think they'll be able to adapt again. Yes, they have social problems, but it also, and this, I want to make this clear, like many other countries in the world, they've also had dramatic successes in health, and particularly in health. in the past 50 years. It's not just a negative story. Things may not be great now, but they're a lot better than they were 50 years ago. There's no polio, river blindness, leprosy. All these diseases are basically on the run. I mean, polio's been eradicated. So you would see these diseases that were prevalent in a place like Egypt 50 years ago that are now gone. That's a great success for the human race, frankly. So they're very resilient. They'll make progress. Again, I think there'll be periods of social upheaval, but the Egyptian people have also seen the effects of the Arab Spring, and it can't just be washed away.
Thank you. I'd like to bring Chris Hislop back on for a few more words, and then we're about out of time. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Ambassador Patterson. This was really an extraordinary experience for our students across Montana. And to you students, I mean, it's pretty amazing to hear the ambassador talk about the connections between Egypt and Montana, not just in terms of, say, agriculture, the importance of water, the importance of tourism, but right at the end, she's talking about a very resilient people, like Montanans are. So the idea here is that Egypt may be very far away from us, but it's not so different, not so dissimilar. There's a lot of connections between you and your communities and Egypt. And so I'd like to encourage you, students, and your teachers to be sure that you're going into the Inspired Classrooms platform here for the challenge to look at Egypt, learning more information about Egypt, inputting your own information about your communities and how it connects to Egypt, and that we have, of course, 3 more sessions on Ireland, Korea, and Chile coming up, and we invite you all to join those. So Ambassador Patterson, thank you once again from the Montana World Affairs Council. Allie, back to you for a wrap-up.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I just want to say thank you to everybody. Thank you, Ambassador Patterson. Thank you to all the schools that participated. Keep those questions. You can email those to us. Would it be all right, Ambassador Patterson, if we passed on any additional questions that we did not get to today?
Of course, I'd be happy to answer the questions that the students have. And again, I hope some of you are interested and will start looking at a future in foreign affairs and the foreign affairs and international corporations or the government, or there's so many interesting opportunities out there that I urge you to explore.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you to everybody. You can send any additional questions to either myself, Allie at inspiredclassroom.com, or Kathleen, and we will get those to Ambassador Patterson. Thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.